In August 2023, a man appeared at the entrance to the RERS office that no one could have recognized at first. Kyle Marsh, missing for 5 years, stood barefoot and emaciated, his face obscured by a tangled beard and wild, matted hair. His clothes were no longer clothes at all, but a tattered piece of animal hide. A shadow of the man who had vanished without a trace in one of the most remote and dangerous corners of the Grand Canyon, Kyle had returned, but not in the way anyone had hoped. His eyes, dull and hollow, betrayed the horror he had endured, and the words he spoke would send chills down the spine of anyone who listened. What happened to him during those 5 long years? And more pressingly, what had happened to his companion, Brandon Lowry, who had disappeared alongside him? The mystery of their disappearance had baffled authorities and left their families in torment. The last anyone had heard from the 2 men was a simple message sent from a satellite phone: "Everything's fine, great views." But now, Kyle's return would reveal the unimaginable. As he spoke, a chilling truth began to emerge, one that would change everything we thought we knew about their disappearance and about the Grand Canyon itself. The answers were far darker than anyone could have imagined. In the early hours of 12 April 2018, Kyle Marsh and Brandon Lowry set out on a grand adventure to explore one of the most breathtaking yet treacherous landscapes on the planet, the Grand Canyon. They had planned the trip meticulously, eager to capture the beauty of the canyon through their lenses, both men skilled photographers, drawn to the wild beauty of the canyon's vastness. Kyle, at 27, had a steady job working as a photographer for a local newspaper, while 9-year-old Brandon made his living as a commercial real estate photographer. Both had a deep passion for landscape photography, and this trip was the perfect opportunity to immerse themselves in the awe-inspiring natural beauty of Bleed, one of the world's greatest landmarks. The route they chose was not an easy one. They had obtained a special permit for a 7-day hike along the Hance Creek Trail, a path known for its difficulty and remoteness. The trail, spanning 12 miles in one direction, was regarded as one of the most challenging in the Grand Canyon. Its isolation and rugged terrain made it unsuitable for most tourists, requiring not only a special permit but also a level of experience that Kyle and Brandon appeared to have. They registered at the Desert View Ranger Station on 11th April, informing the rangers of their intended route and the length of their journey. They were well prepared, equipped with all the necessary supplies: GPS navigators, satellite phones, and enough food and water for the 7-day trek. Their plan was to descend to the river via the Hance Creek Trail, set up camp at the base, and explore the canyon's side canyons for unique shots of the landscape. The last message anyone heard from them was a brief text sent on 14th April from Kyle's satellite phone, sent to his sister, Sarah Marsh, back home in Reno. The message was simple: "Everything's fine. Great views. Brandon shot an amazing sunset yesterday. Tomorrow we're going to explore the side canyons east of camp. We may be out of contact for a day or 2. Don't worry." It seemed routine, reassuring even, and it would be the last anyone would hear from them. By 18th April, when the 2 men had failed to return as planned, concern began to grow. Kyle's sister, Sarah, grew increasingly anxious, and by the evening she contacted the park rangers to report her brother and his friend as missing. It would take hours before the search efforts even began, and those first few hours would prove crucial. The rangers initiated the first phase of the search, following the main Hance Creek Trail in hopes of finding some trace of their whereabouts. However, all they found was the remains of a small campfire and some tin cans, but no sign of the hikers. Their tent and most of their equipment were gone, and it quickly became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The search efforts were stepped up the following day, with a helicopter and a specialized team from the Coconino County Search and Rescue Team joining the search. They scoured the area, combing through the canyon's treacherous, uneven landscape, but there were no signs of Kyle or Brandon. The search teams broadened their search radius, exploring not only the Hance Creek Trail, but also dozens of the canyon's side canyons and gorges. Despite these exhaustive efforts, the teams turned up no sign of the missing men. A few days later, on 21st April, a breakthrough of sorts came when Kyle's red 2014 Jeep Wrangler was discovered parked off an old access road near the Red Canyon Overlook, about 4 miles from the Hance Creek trailhead. The vehicle was locked, and the keys were missing. Inside, they found a plastic water bottle, vehicle registration documents, and a national park map. Strangely, there were no notes or indications of their plans. The car's GPS tracker revealed that the vehicle had been at this location on 11th April at 4:40 p.m. and had remained stationary since then. It was clear that the vehicle had been left behind, not out of necessity, but by choice, perhaps part of the men's journey, or an unexpected detour. As the days wore on, search teams continued to comb through the Grand Canyon with the help of volunteers, more helicopters, and search dogs trained to find people in remote terrain. But despite their best efforts, nothing of significance was found. The canyon is vast, and its rugged landscape offers few clues when someone goes missing. The search area was expanded to cover a 15-mile radius from where the vehicle had been found, but even this extensive search revealed no new information, no footprints, no items, no sign of life. The investigation seemed to be at a standstill. By 28 April, the official search was called off. With no traces of the missing hikers found, Kyle Marsh and Brandon Lowry were declared presumed dead. The search had lasted for weeks, and yet the mystery surrounding their disappearance remained unsolved. The authorities offered a theory that the two men had perhaps fallen off a cliff while attempting to take photographs from a dangerous location. The Grand Canyon had long been known for its hazardous conditions, with dozens of fatalities recorded each year due to dangerous falls. There was even a possibility that their bodies had been washed away by the floodwaters, swept along the canyon's fierce currents after a rainstorm had hit the area. The official investigation shifted focus, with detectives from the Coconino County Sheriff's Office digging deeper into the case. They compiled a detailed report on the last known movements of Kyle and Brandon, including the gas station and grocery store stops they had made before heading into the canyon. Records from the gas station revealed that the men had filled up their vehicle in the town of Tucson around midday on 11th April, purchasing extra batteries and energy bars. Later that afternoon, at a park grocery store, they bought canned food and dried fruit, with witnesses recalling that they appeared well prepared and spoke about the weight of their backpacks. Yet, despite all this information, there were still no concrete answers as to what had happened after they had set foot on the Hance Creek Trail. The families, desperate for answers, hired a private investigator. David Stone, a former FBI agent with experience in tracking missing persons, took on the case and spent several weeks independently investigating the area where Kyle and Brandon had last been seen. He interviewed hikers, park rangers, and employees who had been in the region between 11th and 15th April, but no one could recall seeing them after that fateful morning. There was also a possibility that the two men had deviated from their planned route, but Stone found no evidence to support this theory. His investigation revealed something startling. GPS and cell tower data indicated that there was no reception in the eastern part of the canyon more than 3 miles from the rim, meaning the men's communication had been cut off long before they should have reached their destination. By May 2018, the official investigation reached its conclusion, with no new evidence and no explanation for the men's disappearance. The authorities presumed Kyle and Brandon had perished, victims of the Grand Canyon's unforgiving terrain. The families, still hopeful but with few options left, turned to legal channels. In 2019, Kyle's and Brandon's families fought for compensation from the insurance companies, but these claims were denied, citing the lack of concrete evidence proving their deaths. The situation had taken a toll on both families, and after years of searching, they were left with little more than grief and unanswered questions. In the years that followed, there were other incidents along the Hance Creek Trail, though none as tragic as the disappearance of Kyle and Brandon. The canyon continued to claim victims, and the authorities took measures to improve safety and track hikers more effectively. But for the Marsh and Lowry families, the void left by the unexplained disappearance of their loved ones remained a painful, open wound. Until one day, a 5-year mystery would begin to unravel in the most unexpected way. 5 years had passed since Kyle Marsh and Brandon Lowry had disappeared into the vast and treacherous expanse of the Grand Canyon. In those years, their families had clung to hope, searching for answers that never came. They had been told, repeatedly, that the men were likely victims of the canyon's brutal landscape, that they had fallen, perhaps taken a dangerous shot for a photograph, or worse, been swept away by a flash flood. It was the sort of story that seemed almost comforting in its simplicity, offering the kind of closure that came with an accident. A tragedy, yes, but one with a clear cause. But when Kyle reappeared, half dead and broken, the truth would prove far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The Kyle that walked into the Desert View Visitor Center in August 2023 was not the same man who had left 5 years ago. He was gaunt, his face obscured by a wild tangled beard, and his clothes, or what passed for them, were nothing more than crude, tattered animal hides. His eyes, once full of life, were dull and empty, haunted by something far worse than just the trauma of survival. And when he spoke, the horror of what had happened to him and his best friend Brandon slowly began to unravel in the most chilling way imaginable. Kyle's return was not just a reunion with his family, but the beginning of a revelation that would turn everything they thought they knew about their disappearance on its head. For 5 years, Kyle had been lost to the world, presumed dead, with no trace of him or Brandon ever found. But what had happened to them? What had truly occurred in the depths of the Grand Canyon? As Kyle's broken memories began to return, it became clear that the answers were far more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. Kyle's first words about Brandon's death would haunt anyone who heard them. In the hospital room, struggling to piece together the fragments of his shattered memories, Kyle spoke of Brandon's brutal end. He had been forced to watch as his best friend was slowly and painfully murdered. And it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragic fall. No, what happened to Brandon was far darker. It was a ritual, a sacrifice in a primitive, ancient ceremony. The group that had taken them, who had held them captive for months, were no ordinary people. They were not lost wanderers or other hikers who had simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were the so-called descendants of the Weeping Snake, a name that would chill the blood of anyone who heard it. A cult living in the deepest, most isolated parts of the canyon, hidden from the world, bound together by archaic rituals and beliefs that stretched back hundreds of years. These were not just people, they were the last of an ancient order that considered themselves the protectors of the canyon's sacred lands. And according to them, the modern world was a desecration that needed to be purged. Kyle's memories were fragmented, hazy from the months of abuse, starvation, and psychological torture. But one thing stood clear in his mind: the horror of Brandon's death. After they were captured, Kyle and Brandon had been dragged across the rugged canyon terrain, their hands bound and mouths gagged, to a hidden cave system. The caves were far from ordinary. Inside, they found a place steeped in ritual. There were symbols painted on the walls and an altar covered in animal bones, skulls, and strange carvings. It was a place for rituals, not survival. The group who had taken them were terrifying. The men wore clothes made from animal hides, their faces painted with grotesque tattoos and markings. They were silent, communicating only in strange gestures or through guttural sounds that felt more like animal calls than human speech. Their leader, a man referred to as the Blood, was the oldest of the group. He was covered in scars, and his long white hair marked him as someone with both power and fear among the group. The Blood was the one who led the rituals, the one who dictated who would be sacrificed and who would survive. Brandon had been the first to try to escape. He couldn't bear the captivity any longer, and one evening, as the cult members performed a ritual involving the sacrifice of an animal, he saw an opportunity. In the chaos, he bolted, scrambling up the rock walls in a desperate bid for freedom, but it was hopeless. One of the younger members of the group spotted him, and before he could make it very far, he was captured, dragged back to the cave, and made an example of. The punishment for Brandon's attempt to escape was swift and brutal. A fire was built in the center of the cave, its flames licking the ceiling. Kyle was forced to watch, helpless, as Brandon was tied to a wooden stake and lowered into a pit of smoldering coals. Brandon's screams echoed in the cave as the fire consumed him. Kyle's memories of that night were blurred, but the image of his best friend's death remained burned in his mind, a reminder of the unimaginable cruelty that had been inflicted on him and Brandon in that hellish place. What Kyle hadn't known, what he didn't fully understand until much later, was that he was to be next. The group had no intention of letting him go free. He wasn't just a captive, he was a symbol, a living offering to their gods. The cult believed that the only way to prevent catastrophe, to save the sacred land of the canyon, was through sacrifice. And Kyle was to be their next sacrifice. For weeks, Kyle was kept alive, forced to endure the same rituals that had led to Brandon's horrific death. He was tattooed, burned, and subjected to bizarre ceremonies in which his blood was spilled in offerings to the ancient gods. He was made to participate in these rituals, arranging animal bones, preparing strange potions, and wearing the tattered skins of coyotes and deer. To refuse would mean even more punishment, deeper burns, sharper cuts, a life spent in unbearable pain. But what kept Kyle alive, what kept him going in the face of all that torment, was the glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a way out. His mind, ravaged by pain and isolation, began to look for cracks in his prison. He began to notice things, small things, insignificant to his captors, but vital to him. There were gaps in the cave system, weak spots in the walls where the stone had been worn down by time and water. And in one of these gaps, Kyle saw the possibility of escape. It wasn't an immediate plan. It wasn't something he could act on right away. But it was something to hold on to. And in the dead of night, when the cult members were distracted by one of their rituals, Kyle made his move. He began to loosen the rocks, just enough to create a small gap. Then, when the opportunity arose, he crawled through, fighting exhaustion and pain, and made his way to freedom. It took days for him to make it out of the canyon. He had no food, no water, only the remnants of his strength to guide him. He stumbled through narrow crevices, climbing slippery ledges, and trying to find his way to safety. But after days of wandering in the desert, he was finally discovered by a passerby, a tourist who had no idea the man he found was the missing Kyle Marsh. Kyle's return would send shockwaves through the investigation. The authorities, who had long assumed the men were dead, would now have to face the chilling truth. Kyle and Brandon hadn't just been lost, they had been victims of a cult. And what had happened to them was far darker, far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. For months, Kyle Marsh had been trapped in the deepest, most isolated part of the Grand Canyon, a prisoner of a group whose existence was unknown to the outside world. His days blurred together in a monotonous haze of suffering, fear, and isolation. The primitive cult that had captured him and his friend, Brandon Lowry, called themselves the Descendants of the Weeping Snake, an enigmatic group whose beliefs were as old as the canyon itself. They believed that only through the suffering and sacrifice of outsiders could the land be protected from desecration, and Kyle and Brandon were to be the unwilling pawns in their ancient rituals. Kyle's physical condition deteriorated rapidly in the first weeks of his captivity. He was forced to participate in cruel and demeaning rituals, burning herbs, arranging animal bones, and wearing masks made from the heads of coyotes and deer. The group seemed to delight in his torment, their chants and guttural sounds filling the air as they circled around him like predators. Any resistance was met with swift and brutal punishment, usually in the form of burns from hot metal or cuts with jagged stone knives. The blood, their leader, marked Kyle as a symbol of the modern world's corruption, a symbol that needed to be purified through ritual pain. But amidst this constant brutality, Kyle's mind began to sharpen. Despite the trauma, despite the isolation, he started to notice the details around him. He observed the ebb and flow of the group's rituals, the times when they were distracted, the moments when they let their guard down. His survival instincts, honed over years of living in the modern world, kicked in. He began to devise a plan that would require patience, cunning, and an understanding of the environment that he had been thrust into. The group had been living in a series of caves in the eastern part of the Grand Canyon, and while the place was hidden and seemingly impenetrable, it wasn't perfect. The caves had weaknesses, cracks in the walls, narrow passages, and tunnels that had been eroded by centuries of rainwater. As the days stretched into weeks, Kyle realized that his only chance of survival was to escape. But the conditions needed to be right. He would have to wait for the rain. The monsoon season in the canyon was unpredictable. When it rained, it was as though the entire landscape shifted. The dry desert cracked open, and the rock walls became slippery, the earth beneath them unstable. It was during one of these storms, in the early days of July 2023, that Kyle saw his opportunity. The storm lasted for 4 days, a tension in diviamas and upper, constant downpour that soaked the canyon's dry earth. Kyle watched as the rainwater seeped through the cracks in the caves, eroding the rock and loosening the stones. It was then that Kyle realized that the rains were his ticket to freedom. The rocks that had held him captive, the stones that formed the walls of his prison, were beginning to break apart. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Kyle began his escape plan slowly and cautiously. At night, when the cult members were busy with their rituals, Kyle would work in the darkness. He started loosening the stones in a small corner of his cave, chipping away at the rocks, silently and with great care. Every crack in the wall seemed like a promise, every loosened stone a step closer to freedom. But it wasn't easy. The physical toll of his captivity had left him weak and exhausted. The days he spent working on the wall were exhausting, but he pushed himself to the brink, knowing that this was his only chance to escape. It wasn't just the physical labor that drained him. The constant fear of being caught, the terror of being punished for even the slightest misstep, wore on him mentally. But as the rain continued to fall, Kyle's resolve hardened. The gap he had started to form in the rock was growing. His fingers were raw and bloodied from the constant chipping and scraping, but he kept going, each moment of progress filling him with hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the moment arrived. The storm had caused a section of the cave ceiling to collapse, blocking the main passage that led deeper into the cave system. While the rest of the group was preoccupied with clearing the debris, Kyle saw his chance. He had already loosened enough stones to create a small hole, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. The cult members were distracted, and Kyle had to act quickly. With a mixture of fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins, Kyle crawled through the hole he had created. His body was weak from months of deprivation, and every movement was an agonizing reminder of the torment he had endured. But he kept going, inching his way through the narrow, jagged passage, barely able to breathe in the confined space. His heart raced as he heard the voices of his captors grow distant. For the first time in months, Kyle felt something other than fear. He felt a flicker of hope. The journey through the canyon was grueling. The rock walls were steep and the terrain unforgiving, but Kyle pressed on. He had no food, no water, and his strength was failing him. His body was exhausted, but his will to survive kept him moving forward. For days he stumbled through the canyon, relying on the rainwater that had collected in small rock depressions to drink, scavenging what little he could find to sustain himself. His mind was clouded by exhaustion, but he kept his focus on one thing: escape. The pain was unbearable. Kyle's hands were raw from climbing the rocks, and his legs were stiff from the long days of walking, but he had to keep going. The canyon, which had once seemed so awe-inspiring, now felt like a death trap. The same land that had once drawn him in with its beauty now felt like an unrelenting force, trying to swallow him whole. But Kyle had a different plan. He would not be consumed by the canyon. 3 days later, Kyle reached the Lipan Point Lookout, a spot just a short distance from where the Hans Creek Trail began. It was there, on the edge of the canyon, that he was finally found. A tourist, James Carter, was visiting the lookout and spotted Kyle stumbling across the dry creek bed. The sight of the disheveled, near-death figure of Kyle was enough to send Carter into action. He immediately called emergency services, and Kyle was found just hours later, barely conscious and covered in cuts, bruises, and the scars of his ordeal. Kyle was rushed to the hospital, and the authorities were alerted. But his survival story was just beginning. The discovery of Kyle's escape from the hidden caves of the Weeping Snake cult would send shockwaves through the investigation. The police and the FBI would begin to piece together the horror Kyle had survived, but the story of his escape would haunt them all. Kyle had escaped the clutches of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Kyle's return to the world of the living was miraculous, but the trauma he had endured would stay with him for the rest of his life. The physical scars were only a small part of the pain he carried with him. His mind, fractured by the brutal captivity and the horrors he had witnessed, was slow to heal. But despite everything, he had survived. Against all odds, Kyle Marsh had escaped from the Grand Canyon and the twisted cult that had held him captive. And for the first time in 5 long years, he was free. When Kyle Marsh was found, disheveled and barely clinging to life, his return to civilization marked the end of a 5-year nightmare that no one could have ever anticipated. His survival was nothing short of miraculous, and his story quickly captured the attention of not only his family but the world. The terrifying details of his captivity, his escape, and the brutal death of his friend Brandon would soon become one of the most haunting mysteries ever to come out of the Grand Canyon. Despite the widespread investigation into the cult that had captured Kyle and Brandon, authorities were unable to uncover enough evidence to bring those responsible to justice. The remains found in the caves, including human bones and ritualistic objects, suggested a horrifying truth, but the perpetrators remained elusive, their identities a shadow in the dark. Was it a real cult, living in isolation within the canyon? Or had Kyle's mind, ravaged by his ordeal, conjured this mysterious group from his fractured memories? No one could say for sure. And so, the questions remained. Were the descendants of the Weeping Snake truly a secret, ancient order? Or had they been a figment of Kyle's tortured mind, a coping mechanism for the trauma he had endured? The chilling uncertainty of what happened deep within the Grand Canyon left more than just a scar on Kyle. It left the world wondering if there are darker truths hidden in the most remote corners of the earth, truths we may never fully understand. If you found this story as gripping and unsettling as we did, don't forget to hit subscribe for more true crime mysteries and unsolved cases. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think happened to Kyle and Brandon? Join the conversation, and we'll see you next time.